I think for everybody operating in the third sector for a while, it's safe to say that this is one of the most challenging times that we're going through. Shortage of funding, pressure on volunteers, shortage of volunteers, the rise in demand for our work, for the third sector work. When we talk about cuts in public services, often the spill-off goes to the third sector to pick up on fulfill gaps where public sector provisions fall short of. So rising demand for the work that we do in the third sector combined with shortage of funding, limitations in terms of volunteering recruitment, and also current volunteers are experiencing fatigue. So especially at board level, we are really, really struggling across our sector to recruit and maintain board members. So the third sector is one of the biggest sectors across Scotland. We employ people. Many people still have the perception that the third sector, the voluntary sector, is run entirely by volunteers. There's a good chunk of the work that volunteers do, but we also employ, we generate income for the economy and the Scottish borders, that significant income that's generated across communities, keeping people in employment, developing and retaining skills. It's not secret to anybody that our public sector is facing significant challenges. And that's been going on for a while now. It's building up the challenges with increased cost of living. And, I think I decided to put something in terms of the public cuts and the impact on our sector, even for those organizations who have no public contracts in place, though that spill-off is still felt through. As I said, public service reduction often translates into increase in demand to our third sector provisions. In terms of organizations, 4 in 10 voluntary organizations rely on council's funding or contract. And if you're here in the room and that doesn't apply to you, don't be mistaken. It does. It will impact you. The organizations who have not had any uplift will be looking for funding elsewhere to cover shortfalls. Even for those who don't have contract with the councils, that means that we are competing for the funding that's out there. The past months, if you follow the national funders, we have seen a significant decrease in some of the funding streams that are out there, some of reduction in levels of funding, but also some funding programs that cease to exist altogether. Again, creating more competition in our sector for the limited resources that are available out there. This morning, the Audit Scotland released the news, they published the report around the Audit Commission, highlighting that £647 million is the budget gap across councils in Scotland. 647 million. If we thought we were in a difficult situation, let's think and reflect, because it's not going to get better anytime soon. Clearly, I have depressed everybody enough now in this room. But for the situations that we're going through now, it's not temporary. We need to be realistic. We do need a structural shift in the way that we operate, but also raising our voices in terms of how can we collaborate between us in the third sector with other partners, perhaps even local businesses, and with public sector, because we all have a role to play. There are things that we need to start doing and thinking differently, because the status quo is not an option anymore. Now, as I said, these are difficult conversations. They're not easy. And that's part of the problem. We're not having them. Often we think about collaborations and partnerships. Not often we talk about mergers. They only happen when there is a significant crisis at the door, and they need to happen because there's no other way forward. I think only yesterday I was at the Scottish Parliament meeting a minister, and the first thing the minister highlighted is there's 25,000 registered charities across Scotland. When you think about community groups that are not registered, and probably some enterprises that don't report back to the charity regulator, this number is much higher. I checked this morning just to make sure, 774 registered charities in the Scottish borders. That does not include community groups that are not registered and some enterprises that only report to companies' houses, to the companies' house regulator. So there are plenty of charities across communities. The minister's point yesterday was about, is there anything that we need to do? Because in the Scottish borders, for example, all these organizations will be competing for funding, will be competing for volunteers. How can we work better together? But most of all, with the crisis that we're facing across our sector, how can we start thinking forward and planning ahead so we are not at the cliff edge when it comes to it? We're preparing and safeguarding our future. That requires long-term planning and key decisions. We often talk about collaborations and partnerships, potential mergers. Why it becomes difficult? We're often been talking with partners, and you'll hear from our colleagues later, why that's not happening, or why it's not happening enough. Why are organizations closing before other options or routes are explored? And there are a few potential reasons for that. One, we're not opening up the space to talk and be open about the challenges and the external factors that are impacting our operations and our plans. Another one is everyone wants to be the leader. So even if we start talking about, sussing out another organization that you want to collaborate with, soon, if the organization is not going to be the leader, that conversation stops. Loss of identity is a real problem. An organization that, if you talk about merger, I want to keep my brand and I want to keep my name. So if two wants to keep the brand and the name, that merger probably stops there at one point because that's difficult to move beyond that. There are ways, and we'll hear about that, but that's the real challenges that we're seeing coming, knocking our door, Borders Community Action, as an infrastructure organization supporting the sector. I think that another difficult point that we need to highlight is about the skill set in terms of the board. As I say, it's difficult to recruit and even retain board members these days, but also people at senior level. Nobody wants to have that difficult conversation and spots the early signs of red flags in, cash flow, or even understanding, even asking if the board's understanding financial forecast properly. So there are a few things that we can't brush under the carpet because there are real challenges that accumulate towards the culmination of a potential closure. Another thing that seriously, and we hear about, in terms of HR, is potential job losses. And of course, there's always a risk. Sustainability does not happen by accident. It's not a lucky game. It needs to be planned. And leadership is about never losing the sight of your why. Why did everyone in this room, leading a third sector organization, or those who start a project or a community-based project, you started with your why. You started because you saw a need. You embark on a project. Certainly, we are not in the third sector for the salaries or the bonuses because we get none of it. We are in the sector for a cause that we believe, a difference that we can make. Unfortunately, when crises knock at the door, we are at risk of losing sight of that, of the why. And the why is always about people, the people that we set out to do the work that we do. In terms of the system, I think that is one thing that I wanted to highlight today because I've highlighted the issue around our own responsibility as organizations, as leaders in the third sector, but the system is against us. We can't deny that. I mentioned about the cuts in public funding. I mentioned about the funders and trusts reducing some of the funding programs. Another thing that we need to consider is when asking, and I had this conversation over the years for so many times, why are so many organizations setting up and becoming a charity? The system is against us. Often, instead of merging, we hear about organizations splitting up. Why? Because funders out there are also not flexible. If you get a funded project for 3 years, you can't go back to that funding again for a new project. Usually that's the case. So what happens? An organization starts splitting up projects so they can go for funding out there. So it's also about systems change. Yes, there are ways that there are things that we need to consider and do differently, but the system is against our sector, full stop. That's something that we need to highlight, and that's something that we've been trying to. A few months ago, I wrote to funders directly, challenging some of the decisions. One key message was funders are refusing to fund projects are not in the area of multiple deprivation. In the Scottish borders, that's very hidden. Rural poverty exists, so that's not a clear measure for us in the Scottish borders. But another one is about the short-term funding and small grants that we need to move away from. And also fund what's working. Let's fund, it's a message to funders out there. If a project's working and is delivering, well, fund it. Let's keep it alive. In being proactive, one thing that we are launching is our governance health check. Members of Borders Community Action will have access to a link where you can go and do your own governance health check. Be open and honest, go through the questionnaire, and at the end of the questionnaire, a score will be developed around your governance and with indicators about what needs to be done. But it's giving the people the tools to start exploring these conversations and actually taking action moving forward in what can be done. Every decision that we make is all about the people that we exist to serve, the communities that our charities were set up to do. And I think as long as we keep that at the heart of what any decisions that we make, we can't go wrong.